Okay, so this is Chapter 2, The Planting of English America. This is actually a very important chapter. It talks about how the English first came to the United States, and there's a ton of vocabulary for this chapter, and it's heavily tested on. Alright, so why did the English come to America? Well, it has a lot to do with the Protestant Reformation that you can see at the top. Indirectly Henry VIII, and directly Elizabeth I. So if you remember from world history, Henry VIII is the one that caused the split between the England and Catholicism. He wanted to divorce one of his wives. The Pope wouldn't let him, so he said, the hell with the church. After his death, there was a couple other kings and a queen, or one king and a queen, and there was a lot of basically religious civil war going on. Once Elizabeth I, she's known as the Virgin Queen, once she becomes the head monarch in England, she's been in power for like 50 years, and she's a Protestant, and it really solidifies. So this creates a situation where England is a unified, somewhat strong country that's Protestant. And this causes a lot of problems with their Spanish neighbors. Remember, Spain, the one who essentially discovers the New World, is very strong because of all the gold and silver and the other goods that they're taking out of the New World, and very Catholic. So you have kind of a world war that happens between England and Spain. And depending on the outcome of that war, that determines what happens with England, Spain, and the New World. So, the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I, she has a friend named Sir Walter Raleigh. And what he does is he wants to get in on the New World colonization money making. And so, with her permission, he founds a colony on Roanoke Island, which is in modern-day North Carolina, in 1585. And really nobody knows what happens to it, because he goes back to England, and whoever was remaining in this colony just disappears. When they show up, the English ships show up a year or two later, there's nobody there anymore. There's like some random words inscribed on a tree, but nobody knows what happens to it. So that colony is an absolute failure. The bigger event in English history, as far as we're concerned, is the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. So I told you that the Spanish king, who is Catholic, is basically engaging in a world war versus Protestant England, and he decides to essentially invade England. And so he sends 100 and something ships to England, and smaller English ships are able to basically pester the Spanish Armada, and then, just like a lot of other great naval battles in history, a big storm comes. The English ships are able to get out of the way and get into harbor. The Spanish ships sink in the storm. So that crushing defeat of the Spanish Armada not only saves England from invasion, but it destroys the ability of the Spanish, at least in the short term, from policing the waters, because their fleet's gone. And so the English are able to then send their ships all over the world. And it's really the first step towards English naval superiority that they had for the next several hundred years. And now you have, very similar to how Spain had it that we described in the first chapter, England now has a very powerful monarch in Elizabeth I, a very strong military in that they're their own navy, and they want to get in on this colonization. We're going to talk about mercantilism probably next chapter, but talk about getting this money back to the mother country from lands far away. And so how do they do it? Well, England is a little bit different than Spain. They don't mix a whole lot of religion, and there's no encomienda system or nothing like that. What the English have is the forerunner to modern-day corporations. And this is where we get our first vocab of this chapter. It's called a joint stock company. Basically, you have a bunch of people who invest money and create this thing, this joint stock company. And depending on how much money you put into it, that's the percentage of profits that you'll take. Modern day corporations are basically meant to survive forever, long after the stockholders die. This wasn't the case. A joint stock company was basically just meant to finance one expedition, one activity. And in this case, they were going to finance some boats that were going to go to somewhere in the New World, look for gold, get a bunch of gold, take it back on these ships back to London, and then divvy up the profits. That was the joint stock company. Okay, so the name of the joint stock company was the Virginia Company. Right? And you had to get permission from the monarch, in this case Elizabeth I. No, I'm sorry, Elizabeth was dead now. You had to get permission from the monarch, and that's the charter. Right? Nowadays, you basically also have to get a charter from the government, but you got to fill out a bunch of forms. Back then, you had to also get, basically a sheet of paper that says that you're allowed to do this. The thing about the charter for the Virginia Company, and why it's important for the United States, is that it states that any Englishman who goes in this Virginia Company to somewhere in the New World and is in the New World for X number of years, that they retain the same rights as Englishmen in the New World as they do back in England. And this is going to have a lot of consequences when we start talking about the Revolutionary War, as far as taxation without representation and virtual representation and all that other stuff. But in other words, even though you are a colonist, you're still considered an Englishman, and you're still bound by English law, and you still get the protection of English law. And here you can see they had to recruit people to go to Virginia because, it was as far away and as mysterious of a place as possible. And so this was just an ad that they posted in various places, in various papers in England. Alright, so on May 24th, 1607, 3 ships, don't worry about their names, containing about 100 settlers, landed at Jamestown. It's, if I remember correctly, it's like 60 miles inland from Chesapeake Bay. Chesapeake Bay is the ocean, and then there's the James River is one of the many rivers that dumps into the Chesapeake Bay. So the ships originally wanted to land at the coast of Chesapeake Bay, but they were attacked by Indians. So they went 60 miles inland, and they figured they'd be far enough away from the Indians. They need to find a place that still, the water was deep enough where they could have an ocean vessel that could sit there. And they also wanted a place that was defensible and hopefully find food. But most importantly, they're looking for gold. Well, it was an absolute awful existence. They built this basically triangle fort in like a little bend of the river. It's surrounded by swamp. There's no easy place to get food or clean water. It's still salty water and swamp water. So it's a bad situation from that. And these guys were not set up to survive in the wilderness. They were set up to look for gold, basically. And so right away, they just start dying by the droves. And when they weren't dying by the droves, supposedly, and this is controversial, instead of planting crops or fishing or hunting or building stuff, they just looked for gold or just, hung out because they're supposedly aristocrats who weren't used to hard work. So in 1608, one of the guys that went with him, who was apparently a militaristic hard-ass by the name of John Smith, obtains command or leadership of Jamestown, and he has the infamous quote that you need to know: "He who shall not work shall not eat." So in other words, if you don't work, then you're not going to eat. And so he kind of whipped them into shape, and he's credited with saving the Jamestown settlement in its first year or so. The other John that you have to remember for this time period is John Rolfe. They never do find gold, because there's no gold over there. But what they do come across and uncover, and how the Jamestown is ultimately made profitable, is through the use of tobacco. And John Rolfe was, I guess he experimented with different types of tobacco that grew in the West Indies and in the Virginia area, and he was able to crossbreed them until he came across a strain of tobacco that England really liked and apparently grew well in the Virginia area. The third name that you need to know in regards to Jamestown is Pocahontas. Pocahontas is the daughter of the head Indian chief from the area. The Indians were the Powhatans in this area. Supposedly, she saves the life of John Smith, actually. John Smith was captured, and Chief Powhatan was about ready to execute him. And then, boom, she jumps in front and says, "No, don't kill him." So that's how she's kind of introduced to this tale. And then she actually marries John Rolfe to solidify a peace between the Indians and the Englishmen. And then, of course, she's shipped to England, and she catches some disease and dies real quick, just like they all did. Here is a kind of a rendering of Jamestown. What you can see here down towards the bottom of the picture, the modern shoreline actually cuts into the bottom right bulwark and almost completely the bottom left bulwark. Now, if you're in Jamestown, you can go there nowadays. In the next couple of slides, you'll see some pictures from modern Jamestown. You'll be amazed at how actually small this is. It's probably about you could not even fit a football field within this triangle. All right, it's really small. Obviously, they're under constant threat of Indian attack. So their first task was to build these wooden walls, and you can see the tips, the points of the triangle. They have these circular areas to both guard the river from. They were worried about Spanish ships, and also from Indian attacks. Inside, once they get going, the houses are actually pretty nice, but they're so cramped, and surrounding them on the upper left and the upper right is basically swamp. So it was a horrible place to live, and the swamps are obviously filled with mosquitoes. This is before all modern types of medicine and eradication, so they were getting malaria and other swamp-based diseases. It was really nasty, and so they just they died constantly. There was just massive numbers of colonists that died, and the only way that they survived was every once in a while, every year or so, another ship or two would come and actually replace the dead settlers with live ones from England. Okay, so your book talks about cannibalism. They're talking about the starving time and all this other stuff, and how bleak the existence it got. My favorite one was the story about the husband whose wife died, and he salted her and then ate her. And then of course that's disgusting and against all crimes of humanity, so they killed his ass. But if you go to Jamestown now, they have a museum there, and it's an actual archaeological site, and they're constantly digging there. When I was there this summer, there was a crew that was digging there right when we were right there. Well, they pulled out this skull a couple of years back, and you can see right in the forehead, and it's blown up there in that middle picture, knife marks, where someone had tried to carve into the skull. They determined that it was a female skull, and there's a couple other places by the temple where they show that they were actually able to get in there, and someone was actually able to eat the brain. So they did like an artist rendering of what this woman looked like, and it's a picture of what she looked like at the far right. And so it's theorized that this is the actual woman that was salted and eaten by her husband. So, lucky her. Alright, so inside Jamestown. This is not the actual Jamestown, this is nearby. They basically reconstructed it. And you can see the type of building behind me. The buildings are actually pretty nice. There's a lot of activity. You can see here's a blacksmith, or a recreationist of a blacksmith working there. The actual buildings are fairly nice once they got up and rolling. But the first year or two, until they were able to create these buildings, had to be an absolutely miserable existence. Here is if you actually go to Jamestown, you can go to the actual site right on the river. And you can see they've rebuilt the walls, but they put them in the actual post holes. So if you dig down in the ground, you basically find a different coloration of the dirt. And so they know that that's where one of the posts was. That's where one of the posts was. And so they've built the walls there, and you can see they are extremely flimsy. It's extremely small. They're digging one of the houses here, and you can see here on this picture to the left this brick fireplace that dates back to approximately 1610. So it's pretty cool to actually go to the site and actually see all the stuff that you read about in Chapter 2 and other places. Alright, so looking at a map, you can see here's the Chesapeake Bay here on the right side of the picture, the coast, the James River, and then you can see Jamestown right there. So Jamestown is founded in 1607. Another city nearby is Williamsburg, is founded in 1633. That eventually becomes the capital of the Virginia colony. And then, flash forward several chapters, very, very close. Something like, I don't think it's maybe 10 miles or so, is Yorktown, founded in 1691, and that's the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. So there's lots of historical stuff that's very, very close, and then you're actually pretty close to Washington, D.C. at this area, and a bunch of Civil War sites. Richmond's pretty close to this. So the next major colony that's founded is Maryland. Okay, and you can see Maryland is just due north of Virginia. It's the Potomac River is the boundary line between Maryland and Virginia. The Powhatan Indians, they built long houses like this. They were primarily an agricultural type of Native American, where they weren't riding around on horses and shooting buffalo or nothing like that. They grew corn and they fished in the rivers and in the ocean, stuff like that. But this is the type of house that they lived in. This is the book. You can see this is the Powhatan type of long house. Inside is fairly nice. Smelled. That's about it. Alright, cultural clashes in the Chesapeake. So, very early on, Jamestown and the Powhatan Indians, and there were several tribes that are all kind of grouped together and called Powhatan Indians. There's lots of fighting going on between them. It's theorized that Chief Powhatan, that's Pocahontas' father, that he kind of allied himself with the Jamestown settlers, and he was only speaking on behalf of one or maybe a few of these Powhatan tribes. But what he wanted to do is he wanted to get English weapons, their swords and obviously their muskets, so that he could defeat the other Powhatan tribes. And so that's why, even though they may have treaties with the Englishmen, and then if the Englishmen take a left turn in the woods, all of a sudden they're attacked by another group of Powhatan Indians, because it could be from another tribe. So there's a lot of this small state diplomacy type stuff going on in the woods of Virginia during this time period, and the English settlers were just kind of seen as yet another one of these little tribes that were kind of thrown into this mix. So the first major Anglo-Powhatan War goes from 1610 to 1614. It's just constant warfare between the English settlers and the various tribes. It ends with a treaty between Chief Powhatan and the Englishmen, and it's sealed with the marriage of Pocahontas to John Rolfe. Okay. The next big kind of culture clash that we talk about is the institution of slavery, specifically African slavery. The historical records are extremely sketchy about this, but it appears that in 1619, a Dutch boat, it's called a warship, just kind of shows up off the coast of Jamestown and sells 20 Africans to the colony. And these are the first African slaves, and I have there a question mark, to make it to Virginia. Now, African slaves had been in the New World for well over 100 years at this point, but for the most part, they're in the West Indies, the Caribbean, that area. They're on sugar plantations, which this chapter also talks about. The purpose of that question mark is something that we're going to talk a lot about in class, and that's, were the Africans slaves as we think of it in 19th century America, or were they indentured servants? We're going to talk more about indentured servants later, and thirdly, does it even matter? Because there's a lot of evidence that many of the early Africans that made it to Virginia were freed, and some of them actually became owners of slaves themselves. The third culture clash during this area is actually the Second Powhatan War. This is basically, we're already 20, 30 years into English colonization, and the Indians are getting their butts kicked. And so they kind of group together for one last push, one last attack to try and drive the English out. It's sketchy for a little while, and eventually the English, at this point, are so well settled. They have such a big foothold in the Virginia area that they're able to crush the Powhatans. So that happens in 1644, and your book states that by 1685 the Powhatans are extinct. There are no more Powhatan Indians, which is nuts when you think about it, that in the span of one Powhatan lifetime, you figure if he was born in about 1607 or so, that by the end of his natural life in 1685, that's it. There are the entire race of Powhatan Indians is gone. So that's all right. I was talking about Maryland a little bit before. It's founded by a guy by the name of Lord Baltimore, a convenient name, and he was a very rich guy, friends with the king, and he founded Maryland because he wanted money, just like the Virginia Company. And he was Catholic, and the Catholics were being persecuted in England, so he wanted to create a refuge for his fellow Catholics. The problem is not enough Catholics went to Maryland. So in order to grow the tobacco, just like in Virginia, it was the same type of colony. They end up growing tobacco for sale back in England. He needed cheap labor. And the cheap labor, for the most part, were the English poor, the English homeless. And for the most part, they were actually Protestant. And so this is where you get the vocab term indentured servants. Okay, an indentured servant during this time period was a poor Englishman who couldn't afford food back in England, couldn't afford housing. And so what he agreed to do was to go to the New World and work for a period of years, usually about 7 years or so. And in return for that, he was supposed to receive a little bit of money at the end of the 7 years, perhaps a little plot of land, but most importantly, his master or employer paid for the ship's voyage from England to the New World. And so that's how the vast number of early Englishmen came to the New World. They came as indentured servants. All right, the Carolinas. So shifting south a little bit. Carolinas, they developed very differently. I don't know, very differently, but different focus than Virginia and Maryland, because they weren't geared towards tobacco. They weren't really geared towards any type of religious persecution like that we later see in New England. What they're geared towards is the West Indies, actually. Specifically Barbados and other areas there in the lower kind of Atlantic island area. They were basically meant to be the breadbasket to feed those sugar islands, the sugar colonies off the coast there. And the type of people that came to the Carolinas actually didn't come directly from England. They started out in these islands, and because of money and various reasons, they then migrated to the Carolina region, but still retained most of their trade and most of their communication with those islands. So they're looking south, as opposed to Virginia and Maryland, which are looking just basically due east towards England. So what are they growing? They're growing rice. It's a very watery, swampy area. When we're talking about these colonies, we're not, and we say Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, we're not talking about their more modern boundaries. We're really talking about stuff that hugs the coast, right? In Jamestown's case, it was 60 miles inland. That was pretty deep inland. Most of these colonies and the villages and cities that they develop along the coast. And so it's those tidal regions that they're actually growing these crops in. Obviously, because I said it was swampy, you also have malaria's problem there, and one of the things that requires growing rice is it's a very labor-intensive crop, and basically you're standing in ankle-deep water planting these crops and harvesting these crops. And there's lots of labor to be done in a swamp for rice. Well, the Englishmen were dying from malaria. The local Indians who didn't have immunities to malaria were dying, but who has a relative immunity-based buildup in their blood, and it's racial Africans. It's actually the same trait that causes sickle cell anemia. Also creates a situation where you're somewhat immune, or you have lesser effects to the malaria. So that creates a need for African slavery in the Carolinas. This is just a timeline, and you can see here we got the Virginia Company founds Jamestown 1607. You got Lord Baltimore about 25 years later or so, the early 1630s, and then going down, you can see. We'll talk about South Carolina. Screw it. See a map there. Basically, your book talks about North Carolina is separated between Virginia and South Carolina. South Carolina has a bunch of the aristocrats from the Barbados area. Virginia has the aristocrats from England, and North Carolina has a bunch of squatters, basically poor white trash that flee the South Carolina and Virginia colonies in search of cheap, or in this case, free land, and that's where they are. So they were looked down upon by both their southern and northern neighbors. Georgia, which you can see at the far south there, was created as a buffer zone. Because remember, Spain and England are almost constantly at war during this time period. Spain owns Florida, and so they were worried about both Indian attack and Spanish attack on the very popular and profitable South Carolina colony, and so the English found Georgia very, very late in the game as basically just like a place to protect the other colonies. So we're going to talk next chapter about the northern colonies in New England and why they were founded and what they would look like. At the end of the day, these southern colonies are called the Plantation Colonies, and they're focused almost purely on profit, right? On making money. And after it became apparent that they weren't going to find gold, they had to make their money somewhere else, and that was through agriculture. But they're not growing potatoes and corn and tomatoes and other stuff that you can basically use. They're almost always growing cash crops, right? With the exception of rice. But you got to remember, what was rice being used for? It wasn't to feed the masses back in England. It was to basically feed the slave labor in the sugar islands off the coast. So these are cash crops. Tobacco, rice, indigo is another one that's talked about. And so you have these huge farms that are created. And on these farms, which later become called plantations, you have a large number of workers, oftentimes slaves, sometimes indentured servants, or a mixture of both. And on these plantations, they kind of create everything they need. So on site, on every plantation, there would be a blacksmith. There would be a carpenter. There would be all this other stuff that you would find in a city, that you could buy in a city, that they would make just on their own plantation. So because you have these plantations that are self-sufficient, it's a disincentive to create cities. It's also a disincentive to migrate to this area. And so what you see is these southern colonies don't have big cities, don't have large numbers of immigrants coming to them, because you're either coming as a slave or as an indentured servant. Neither prospect is nice. And because you don't have these urban areas, you don't really see these big, powerful churches or schools. This is the chronology. This is what I was thinking about a couple of slides ago. So you got Elizabeth I becoming Queen of England in 1558. You got Sir Walter Raleigh founding the colony at Roanoke that fails and disappears, the lost colony, in 1585. Big date here, 1588, the English defeats the Spanish Armada. This creates this power vacuum now in the New World that England steps in and takes over. So Queen Elizabeth dies in 1603, so James I becomes the king. You get Jamestown founded in 1607. In 1612, so 5 years later, that's when John Rolfe creates his sweet tobacco. You get the first Powhatan War ending in 1614. This was the marriage between Pocahontas and John Rolfe. The first Africans arrive in 1619.